Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I am going to tell you how the Vikings lived in the North Pole. The North Pole. Close your eyes and let yourself be swept away by the story. Please subscribe and leave a comment. Qualton across the northern reaches of Scandinavia in Iceland, along the fjords of Norway, and in the scattered Norse settlements of Greenland, winter did not simply mean cold. In the far north, above and near the Arctic Circle, it meant the near total disappearance of the sun itself. Weeks upon weeks, where daylight shrank to pale gray smudge on the horizon before vanishing entirely. This was the world the Vikings inhabited, a world where survival was never guaranteed and where an entire culture had to be built. Generation after generation, around brutal certainty that darkness and cold would return every single year. The people we call the Norse farmers, sailors, and raiders of the 8th through 11th centuries are often remembered today for their longships and their raids across the coasts of Europe. But the raiding season itself was as a summer activity. May it made possible only because the rest of the year, and especially the winter, was spent in disciplined preparation. Surviving a northern winter was not a matter enduring a few uncomfortable months. It was the defining challenge around which nearly every aspect of Norse life was organized, from the shape of their houses to the rhythm of their farming calendar, to the stories they told their children by firelight. What makes the Viking approach to winter survival so remarkable is not any single invention or technique, but the sheer completeness of the system they built. Nothing was left to chance. Food had to be preserved months in advance. Since nothing would grow once the frost set in, livestock had to be sheltered and fed through months. Pasture was buried under snow. Homes had to be built. Easily prove fatal to anyone caught unprepared. Over the course of this journey, we will move through each of these imsrend and cultural leaning roth, the communal effort, and the deep cultural meaning the Norse people built around the long, dark nights of the North. Chapter 2. The Longhouse, an engine built for warmth. At the center of Viking winter survival stood a single structure. The Longhouse, a building whose design reflected centuries of hard-won knowledge of how to keep a family in extreme cold. These structures, often 30 to 70 feet in length, though sometimes considerably longer for wealthy chieftains, were low to the ground with thick walls, were constructed from timber where available, or from turf and stone in regions like Iceland and Greenland, where trees were scarce. Turf walls, in particular, proved remarkably effective as insulation. Their dense layered construction trapping heat far far more effectively than many builders today might expect from what looks, from the outside, like a simple mound of earth. The roof of a typical longhouse was similarly built for insulation rather than appearance, layered with and supported by a sturdy timber frame, cooler frame, creating a structure that from a distance could almost disappear into the surrounding landscape. Its rounded, earth-covered form shedding wind and holding in warmth far better than a steep, exposed roofline would have. Inside, the space was organized around a long central hearth running down the middle of the main room, the primary source of both heat and light throughout the dark winter months. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, since chimneys as we understand them today had not yet been developed, and the resulting smoky, dim interior, while far what modern comfort would demand, provided a survivable and often surprisingly a cozy environment for a family and its animals during the harshest stretches of the year. Space inside the longhouse was used with remarkable efficiency. Raised platforms lined the long walls, doubling as seating during the day and sleeping areas at night. Often covered with furs and woolen blankets to add another layer of insulation between the sleeper and the cold air near the floor. In many farms, particularly smaller ones, one end of the longhouse was partitioned off entirely for livestock, a practice that served purposes at once, protecting valuable animals from the cold and allowing their body heat to help warm the human living space and on the other side of the wall. This close, practical relationship between people and animals under a single roof reflects just how tightly interconnected every element of Norse truly was. Chapter 3: Fire, Oil, and the Battle Against Darkness. With daylight reduced to only a few hours, or in the far north disappearing almost entirely for weeks at a time, artificial light became a necessity rather than a convenience, and the Norse people developed several reliable methods to keep their homes lit through the long winter nights. The central hearth fire, fed continuously with wood, peat, or dried dung, depending on what fuel was locally available, provided the primary source of both heat and light, and considerable effort went into maintaining it, since allowing the fire to go out entirely in the depths of winter could quickly become. Beyond the central hearth, Norse households relied heavily on oil lamps, typically simple stone or clay vessels filled with animal fat or fish oil, fitted with a wick and made from moss or plant fiber. In coastal and fishing communities, the oil rendered from fish livers, particularly cod, provided an abundant and effective fuel source, one that burned reliably even if it produced a distinctive smell that the smoky interior of the longhouse. Seal oil served a similar purpose in regions where seals were hunted and talloed and tallow, rendered animal fat, offered another widely used option, particularly for smaller lamps, used to light specific tasks such as weaving. During the darkest hours, firewood and fuel supplies had to be gathered and stored well in advance. Since Finch, venturing far from the settlement, could collect wood once deep and ice had set in, was both difficult and dangerous. In regions like Iceland, where trees were far scarcer than in mainland Scandinavia due to and harsher climate, fuels such as dried peat and even dried animal dung became essential substitutes. Carefully collected, stored through the more accessible months of spring, summer, and early autumn, this constant, forward-looking preparation for fuel, much like the preparation of food, reflects a broader theme running through every aspect Viking winter survival. The understanding success in the cold, dark months depended entirely on the discipline and foresight exercised during the brighter that came before. Chapter 4: Provisioning for months without growth. Perhaps aspect of Viking winter survival demanded more careful planning than food. Once the growing season ended and the ground froze solid, nothing new could be harvested, meaning an entire household's food supply for the winter, often stretching across six months or more in the far north, had it produced, gathered, and preserved during the shorter warm season. The margin for error was thin, and a poor harvest or failed fishing season could mean genuine famine before the return of spring, a reality reflected in the sagas, which occasionally described difficult winters and the hardship that followed them. Preservation techniques formed the backbone of this system. Fish, an essential part of the Norse diet, given the proximity of most settlements to the sea or to rivers and lakes, was commonly dried in the open air, taking advantage of cold, windy conditions that prevented spoilage without requiring salt, a valuable and sometimes scarce commodity. This dried fish, known in later periods by the term stockfish, could be stored for extremely long periods and rehydrated as needed throughout the winter. Meat from livestock slaughtered in the autumn. A practice also reduced the number of animals that needed to be fed through the winter. Preserved through smoking, salting, or drying, methods that drew out moisture and inhibited back the bacterial growth that otherwise caused the meat to rot. Dairy played an equally central role in Norse winter visioning. Milk from cows, goats, and sheep, abundant during the warmer months, was transformed into products that could survive long storage, including a soft, firm-like fermented product known as skyr, as various forms of cheese and butter, and some that packed and buried in bogs, where the cool, low oxygen conditions acted as a natural preservative. Grain, where it could be successfully grown in northern growing season. Particularly barley was stored dry and ground into flour as needed throughout the winter for bread and porridge. Wild foods, including berries brewed in their own juices or dried, along with nuts and certain preserved vegetables, rounded out a diet that, while monotonous by modern standards, was carefully engineered to provide the calories and nutrients needed to survive months of cold, physical labor, and limited sunlight. Chapter 5: Wool, Fur, and the Technology of Staying Warm. Clothing in the Viking world was far more than simple covering. It was a carefully developed technology essential to the scything temperatures that could easily prove fatal without proper protection. At the foundation of Norse winter clothing was wool, produced from the hardy sheep breeds raised throughout Scandinavia and the North Atlantic settlements, animals specifically suited to the harsh climate and capable of producing a dense, weather-resistant fleece. Norse wool, particularly from breeds still found in Iceland and the Faroe Islands today, contained a unique combination of coarse outer fibers that shed moisture and wind, and a softer inner layer that trapped warm air close to the body, an early and remarkably effective form of natural insulation. Norse women, who typically bore primary responsibility for textile production within the household, spent enormous amounts of time and skill spinning wool into thread and weaving it into cloth using upright looms, a labor-intensive process that made warm clothing a precious, carefully maintained resource rather than something easily replaced. Multiple layers were standard practice, with looser outer garments allowing air to circulate and provide additional insulation, while tighter inner layers held warmth close to the skin. Cloaks, often fastened with a decorative brooch that also served a practical function in securing the garment high against wind, provided an additional outer layer of protection. Particularly important for anyone who needed to travel or work outdoors during the coldest stretches of winter, for supplemented wool as an essential winter material, particularly among unwealthier Norse families who could afford furs from animals such as bear, and various northern mammals, traded through extensive Norse trade networks reaching into the far north, eastward in what is now Russia. Boots and shoes were typically made from leather, sometimes lined with fur or additional wool for warmth, and mittens, essential for protecting hands during outdoor work in freezing temperatures, were knitted from wool as well. Taken together, this layered system of wool, fur, and leather represented a sophisticated adaptation to an extreme climate, one refined over generations of trial, observation, and careful craftsmanship passed down within Norse households. Chapter 6: Sheltering. The animals that made survival possible. Livestock formed the backbone of the Norse agricultural economy. And keeping these animals alive through the winter was every bit integral to a family's survival as preserving their own food supply, since cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs provided milk, meat, wool, leather essential to daily life. As autumn progressed and pasture became increasingly scarce under frost and eventually snow, Norse farmers faced a critical decision each year regarding how many animals could realistically be fed through the winter months, since hay and other stored fodder were limited resources that had to be carefully thrashed cold season. This reality led to the practice of a significant autumn slaughter, sometimes referred to in later Scandinavian tradition by terms describing the blood month, during which farmers culled a portion of their livestock, keeping only the animals judged most valuable for breeding or milk production through the following spring, while the meat slaughtered animals was preserved for winterfulesterd ued. This annual calculation, balancing the number of mouths that needed feeding against the limited hay and fodder available, one of the most consequential decisions a Norse farming household made each year. One that directly determined both food supply and their ability to rebuild their herds. Spring finally returned. The animals that survived the autumn slaughter were typically moved into byres, closed shelters, often built adjoining, or even connected directly to the family longhouse. As mentioned earlier, allowing farmers to hunt to their animals without venturing far from the warmth of their own home during the harsh weather. Hay gathered and dried during the summer months formed primary winter feed, supplemented in different years by ever additional fodder could be found, including tree branches, moss, seaweed in coastal regions. The careful, unglamorous work of maintaining livestock through the winter, checking on animals, providing feed and water, and managing the always present risk of disease or injury within close winter quarters formed a quiet but absolutely essential part of the daily rhythm of Norse winter life. Chapter 7: Firelight, Stories, and the Rhythm of Indoor Life. With the fields frozen, the ships pulled ashore and outdoor work reduced to only was absolutely necessary. Winter in the Norse world became a season defined by indoor activity, much of it around the long central hearth of the longhouse. This was the season for craftsmanship, for the patient, detailed work that summer's outdoor labor left little time for. Wood carving, the production and repair of tools, weapon maintenance, and above all textile production kept hands busy through the long dark evenings. Work often carried out by the light of the oil lamps described earlier, close enough to the hearth to benefit from its warmth as well. Storytelling held a place of of particular importance during these long winter evenings. And it was during this season that much of the oral tradition later preserved in the Icelandic sagas, Binris. Recited, refined, passed down between generations. Tales of ancestors, of voies and conflicts, of gods and legendary heroes provided both an entertainment and a vital form of cultural transmission. Younger members of the household, the history, values, and identity of their family and community during a season when few other distractions competed for attention. Riddles, poetry, and games, including strategy board games such as Hnefatafl, a Norse tabletop game involving defense of a central cane piece, offered further entertainment during these long, dark stretches confined largely indoors. This period of relative confinement also served an important soul function, drawing households closer together, whether that meant an individual unit within a smaller farm, or, in the case of a chieftain's hall, a broader community of retainers, guests, and dependents sharing the warmth and protection of a larger longhouse. Through the winter months, the close physical proximity required by winter survival, families, and often livestock sharing a single heated space for months at a time, reinforced soul bonds and obligations that carried practical importance well beyond the winter season itself, contributing to a broader culture of mutual obligation and communal support that shaped, as a whole, chapter Yule and the promise of the returning Sunday. Amid the darkest stretch of the year, the Norse people observed a midwinter festival known as Yule, a celebration that predates the arrival of Christianity in Scandinavia, and that would later be absorbed in modified form into Christmas traditions as Christianity gradually spread through the Norse world from the 10th honored. Yule marked the winter solstice, the point at which the sun, having retreated further and further from the northern sky with passing week, finally began its slow return, and the festival served as both a practical celebration, drawing the last substantial food reserves before the harshest weeks of winter still to come, and a deeply symbolic marker of hope during the darkest days of the year. Feasting stood at the center of Yule celebrations, with families and communities sharing meat and mead in gatherings that reinforced social bonds during a season otherwise defined by isolation and hardship. Sacrifices, referred to in Old Norse sources as blot, were made to the gods during this period as well, seeking favor and protection for the household and community through the remainder of the winter, reflecting the deeply held Norse belief that survival depended not only on practical preparation, but on maintaining right relationships with the divine forces believed to govern fate, weather, and fortune. Norse mythology itself contained explanations for the extreme darkness cold experienced during the winter months, particularly through stories involving Sol, the goddess who guided the sun across the sky, and her flight from a great wolf pursuing her. A mythological framework that gave cultural and religious meaning to the very real astronomical phenomenon of the sun's disappearance in the far north during the depths of winter. Yule and the broader mythology surrounding the sun's retreat and eventual return. The Norse people. Just a practical pause for feasting and rest amid an exhausting season of labor, but a shared cultural framework for understanding, enduring one of the most demanding aspects of life. From Earth, Chapter 9, Hardship, Health, and the Limits of Preparation. For all the ingenuity built in Norse winter survival, the season remained genuinely dangerous, and no amount of preparation eliminate risks by extreme cold, prolonged darkness, and the isolation of communities often separated by considerable distances once travel became difficult and ice. The sagas and later historical records occasionally describe severe winters marked by food shortages, livestock loss, and genuine hardship, particularly in more marginal settlements such as those established in Greenland, where the challenges of the northern climate proved especially unforgiving, and where archaeological evidence suggests that some communities ogle to the struggles across the same selves. Across the centuries, health during the winter months presented its own particular challenges. Reduced sunlight limited the body's natural production of vitamin D, though the Norse diet, rich, fat and fatty fish and fish liver oil, likely provided meaningful new compensation. Since these foods are now understood to contain substantial amounts of this vitamin, an example of how practical dietary habits developed through generations of experience rather than any formal scientific understanding happened to address challenge posed by the northern winter. Close quarters within the long house, while essential for warmth, also all created conditions in which illness could spread readily among family members and, in larger households, among a wider group of residents and livestock in the sharing the space. In closed space, injuries and illness during winter carried heightened risk as well. Since seek helps from neighboring farms or, in more serious cases from individuals with medical knowledge, practical herbal knowledge and religious or magical practice offered some measure of care, but the fundamental vulnerability created by isolation during the winter months remained a persistent feature of life in the Norse world. This underlying hardship, often understated in popular depictions of Viking culture that emphasized adventure and conquest. For an essential part, understanding what winter survival truly demanded. Not simply clever technique, but sustained endurance in the face of real and sometimes unavoidable risk. Chapter 10: The Long Winters. The Norse World. Looking back across the full picture of Norse wind survival, from the carefully engineered warmth of the longhouse to the disciplined preservation of food, from technology, the wool clothing, to the cultural meaning embedded in Yule, and the mythology of the returning sun, a clear pattern emerges. Surviving the long, dark, and cold northern winter was never the result of a single clever solution, but of an entire interconnected system built through generations of accumulated knowledge, planning, and close communal cooperation. This system shaped Norse society far beyond the winter months themselves. The very possibility of the famous summer voyages, the trade expeditions and raids that carried Norse sailors across much of the known world during this period, depended entirely on a community's ability to survive the winter that preceded it, to preserve enough food, maintain enough livestock, and keep enough people alive and healthy to build and crew a ship to farm the following season, and to sustain the social structural. In the first place, winter survival was not separate from the more celebrated achievements of Viking exploration and expansion. It was the essential, if less glamorous, found upon which everything else was built. In the end, the story of how the Vikings endured their long Arctic winter nights is a story of remarkable adaptation, of a people who transformed one of the most difficult climates on Earth into a place where families could not. It is a reminder that behind every image of the Viking warrior or explorer's less celebrated story of careful preparation, patient craftsmanship, and the deep, practical wisdom required simply to make it through to spring.